The room is hot and the air smells of copper. You are kneeling on packed earth, a thin reed mat beneath your knees, and the sound of chanting presses against your skull like a dull drumbeat. Torches spit their smoke into the rafters above, staining them black, while a line of men in linen skirts watch you with the same coldness they'd reserve for a goat about to be slaughtered. You already know what's coming because you've seen it done before. In Sumer, in Assyria, and later across Mesopotamia, this was the price of power, the ticket to live among kings and gods without ever threatening their bloodlines. The priests call it purification, but you know better. It is castration, plain and brutal, and you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is right now. I love imagining the glow of your phone in some distant city, maybe on a night as sleepless as this one. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The blade is small but vicious, sharpened bronze that catches the flicker of firelight. A man steps forward, bare-chested, with his hand steady from long practice. He is not here to kill you, at least not directly. His role is to unmake you, removing what defines you as a man so that you can be trusted to serve in the temple, in the palace, or in the inner chambers of the gods. To be near the king's wives, to guard the secrets of sacred idols, you must first surrender your future. The cut is fast, but the pain is endless, filling every chamber of your body until you are nothing but fire and screaming servants. Historians still argue whether these early castrations were performed publicly or privately. Some argue they were displays of loyalty, almost like a grotesque initiation rite. Others insist they were done behind closed doors. The screams muffled by drums and chanting so the gods would hear devotion, not agony. What we know for certain is that the practice produced a class of men, eunuchs, who would shape the politics of kingdoms for centuries. Imagine that, empires balanced on the absence of something so personal, so violently taken. And here's the cruelest irony. Some who endured the blade didn't just survive, they thrived. Eunuchs could rise to immense power, precisely because they could never father heirs and therefore pose no dynastic threat. One quirky detail buried in clay tablets suggests that some eunuchs even claimed to hear the gods more clearly afterward, as if the silence in their bodies left room for voices from beyond. Whether that's spiritual truth or just a coping mechanism, no one can say. Still, for every survivor, countless others bled out in those dim temple chambers. There were no clean scalpels, no antiseptic washes, only bronze, obsidian, or sharp bone, and maybe a smear of ash or resin pressed into the wound. Infection was a death sentence, and it lurked in every cut. Yet the ritual persisted, generation after generation, because it reinforced control. You could say it was the ultimate leash, turning men into guardians who could never become rivals. Remember that faint torchlight. It would follow you, even in dreams. Long after the chants ended and the wound scarred, that smell of copper and smoke would hang in your mind. And perhaps that was part of the point. Castration wasn't only about removing flesh, it was about engraving fear into memory, ensuring loyalty not just in body but in spirit. You'd carry that night forever, even if you rose to stand beside kings. The corridors of the Forbidden City are quiet tonight, but you can almost hear the shuffle of thousands of felt shoes that once passed along these red-lacquered halls. In Imperial China, the price of entry into this world of silk screens and jade cups was steep, and it was measured in flesh. Boys, often no older than 10 or 12, were led into dim side chambers where men with practiced hands waited. The families who brought them here were not naive, they knew exactly what would happen. But for a poor household, the gamble was clear. Lose one child's future and maybe secure wealth and influence for the entire clan. The method itself was chilling in its efficiency. Unlike Mesopotamia's partial cuts, the Chinese procedure was often total. They didn't just take part of you, they took everything. The penis and the testicles together were called the treasure, and when it was cut away, it was stored in a jar of brine or vinegar and handed back to the family as proof of the act. That jar became a grotesque family heirloom, because without it, a eunuch could not be buried with dignity. It sounds absurd, but burial customs mattered deeply. The idea was that when the eunuch died, his treasure should be rejoined with him in the grave so that he could face the afterlife whole. Imagine carrying that jar sealed and floating with what had once been part of your son for decades. The pain, of course, was staggering. Accounts describe boys fainting on the spot or writhing until their small bodies went still from blood loss. Sometimes they were forced to sit in cold water afterward to stem the bleeding, and vinegar was poured directly onto the wound to cauterize it. You can almost feel the sting just thinking about it. And yet, unbelievably, some survived, healed, and rose to astonishing power. In the Ming dynasty, for example, entire bureaucracies were run by eunuchs who wielded influence greater than many nobles. Historians still argue whether parents were coerced into offering up their sons, or whether the promise of palace connections was incentive enough. Some say desperate families practically begged officials to accept their boys, while others believe children were tricked or sold by traffickers. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. What's undeniable is that eunuchs became indispensable to the machinery of Chinese governance. They could read the emperor's private edicts, guard the concubines, and whisper advice in moments that shaped the empire's fate. A quirky detail emerges from records of eunuch households. Despite the physical absence of manhood, many still adopted sons. Sometimes they purchased young boys to carry on their name, sometimes they raised nephews, sometimes they simply surrounded themselves with protégés. In this way, they kept their influence alive, even as their bloodline ended. There's a strange defiance in that, an insistence that legacy can outwit biology. And yet, no matter how powerful, every eunuch carried the same secret shame. The scar was always there, the absence impossible to ignore. Some wore special plugs or tubes to allow them to urinate because the surgery left their bodies so altered. One surviving set of instructions from the Qing period even details how eunuchs were to clean themselves daily, lest infection creep in. You can imagine the endless, humiliating ritual of keeping wounds fresh and sterile in a palace that glittered with gold. You walk those silent halls now, picturing them filled with pale-faced boys clutching the hems of their robes, their eyes wide as they approach the Chamber of Knives. The Forbidden City feels colder when you remember that behind its vermilion walls, survival sometimes depended on how much of yourself you could lose, and as the echo of sandals fades, you realize, here, power was always purchased with sense, and silence had to be cut into the body first. The mosaic floors of Constantinople shimmer in the lamplight, but tonight they feel less like decoration and more like a warning. You're standing in the grand corridors of the Byzantine Empire, where political betrayal was punished with brutal imagination. Here, castration wasn't just a way to produce loyal servants, it was a calculated weapon of power, a method of erasing rivals so thoroughly that they could never return to the throne. And sometimes it was paired with another devastating act, blinding. Imagine this scene. A man who had once commanded armies or held the title of emperor is dragged before a court of stone-faced attendants. His robes are ripped away, not for humiliation alone, but to prepare him for the knife. In Byzantine thinking, castration destroyed a man's claim to the imperial lineage, because only a man who could father heirs was considered fit to rule. If you couldn't produce sons, you couldn't build a dynasty. Add blindness to the punishment, and suddenly the threat of rebellion or a return to power became almost impossible. The methods varied, but all were chilling. Some accounts describe red-hot irons used to cauterize the wound immediately, while others suggest knives followed by vinegar rinses. Yes, the same sting you're cringing at right now. Blinding, too, came in multiple cruel forms, gouging with metal, pressing heated glass against the eyes, or simply pouring boiling liquids. Historians still argue whether these punishments were done in public as warnings, or in private chambers to preserve some twisted sense of imperial dignity. Either way, the result was the same, a rival transformed into a living reminder of the emperor's absolute control. One famous case is that of Constantine VI. In the year 797, his own mother, Irene of Athens, arranged for him to be blinded so she could take the throne herself. The blinding was so severe that he died soon afterward. Castration was often paired with similar political ends, cutting away not just flesh but legacy, possibility, the very idea that power could pass through your bloodline. Think of it as history's cruelest disqualification notice, written directly onto the body. And yet here's a quirky little note tucked into Byzantine sources. Eunuchs in Byzantium were not always despised. In fact, Many of them were trusted precisely because their inability to sire children meant they couldn't found rival dynasties. They served as chamberlains, generals, even high-ranking bishops. Some were described as particularly pious, with voices said to be clearer than bells when they sang in the great cathedrals, possibly a side effect of the castration changing their vocal range. Imagine the irony. The same empire that mutilated them then celebrated their angelic voices in church. The debate that lingers among scholars is whether eunuchs truly wielded freedom, or whether their power was always just an extension of imperial will. Were they respected for their abilities, or were they simply useful tools like ornate candelabras or jewelled swords? Perhaps the answer shifts depending on which palace corridor you walk down. You can almost hear the echo of boots on marble, the whispered decrees that sealed the fate of men in torchlit rooms. One moment, a general feasts beside the emperor. The next, he is dragged to a chamber where the blade waits. And once the act is done, once the blood has dried and the sight has vanished, he is still alive. That was the final cruelty of the Byzantine method. The rival wasn't killed outright, he was left to wander the empire, a living, breathing monument to what happened when you dared to challenge the throne. Picture it now, the clatter of chains, the sharp smell of iron, the last glimpse of a golden mosaic before darkness swallows everything. You're still breathing, but your future has been stolen, cut and burned away in the name of imperial security. And the empire keeps turning, the mosaics keep gleaming as if nothing at all has changed. The steppe wind cuts across your face like a whip, carrying the smell of horse sweat and smoke. You are with the Scythians now, nomadic warriors who lived and died on horseback, their lives stitched together by leather straps and sharpened iron. Out here on the endless plains where battles could erupt at dawn and vanish by sunset, castration was not ceremonial, not cloaked in ritual chants or the marble halls. It was fast, dirty and brutal, a field method born of survival and cruelty. The so-called horseman's cut was often done with whatever blade was at hand. A sword freshly pulled from a corpse, a curved knife used to skin animals, or even a shard of metal heated red hot in the embers of a campfire. Captured enemies could be held down by 3 or 4 warriors, their screams lost in the thunder of horses nearby. With one swift slice the deed was done, and the wound was sometimes cauterized immediately with that glowing iron. Imagine the smell. Burnt flesh, mingled with horsehair, carried on the same wind that rattled the steppe grass. You can almost taste the bitterness of it. The Scythians had practical reasons for this method. Castrated captives could be enslaved without fear of rebellion or future families seeking revenge. They could also be forced into serving the warrior bands, tending animals, or even watching over the prized horses. Historians still argue whether these mutilations were performed more for intimidation or practicality, but the result was the same: a trail of broken men left in the wake of nomadic conquest. One quirky note buried in Greek accounts of the Scythians is their unusual use of horsehair. After cutting, they would sometimes bind the wound tightly with strands pulled from a horse's tail. The logic was that horsehair, being strong and coarse, acted like a tourniquet, slowing the bleeding. Of course, infection was almost inevitable, but on the open steppe, death was as common as rain. If you survived, it was almost considered proof that the gods, or the spirits of the horses, favoured you. And if you did survive, your life became one of silence and servitude. You might be forced to sing in the camps, your altered voice high and strange, a haunting sound in the flickering glow of fires. Or you might be marched for days behind the herd, always in the dust, never in the saddle. Your body marked you as something other, something less than a warrior. And yet in that strange twist of history you still lived among them, a constant reminder of what their knives could do. Picture yourself in that moment, the grassland stretching forever, the stars sharp and merciless above. You lie on the cold ground, horsehair biting into your skin, and the irons burn, still smouldering against your body. Around you, the camp hums with laughter and music, the warriors drinking fermented mare's milk while you drift in and out of fevered sleep. Survival is no blessing, it only means you'll awaken tomorrow into a life you no longer control. The Scythians rode on, their cruelty woven into their legends, their shadows stretching as long as the steppe itself. And in the wake of their hooves, the memory of the horseman's cut lingered, a reminder that power could be taken as swiftly as a gallop, as suddenly as the downward flash of a blade. The abbey bells toll softly in the distance, but their sound does little to cover the whispers crawling through these stone corridors. You are in medieval Europe now, where the church claimed authority not only over souls but often over bodies too. While most monasteries devoted themselves to quiet prayer and labour, there existed darker corners of the ecclesiastical world where silence was enforced in cruel and unspeakable ways. Castration in this context became less about empire or slavery and more about punishment, scandal and control hidden behind cloister walls. Picture a young priest accused of breaking his vows, perhaps caught in the company of a woman, or worse, accused of fathering a child. The official punishments might be fasting, public confession or exile, but in whispered records and scattered chronicles you find hints of something harsher. Mutilation carried out not in courts of law but in abbots' chambers. Castration was the ultimate solution to carnal weakness, stripping away the temptation itself. It wasn't officially sanctioned in canon law, at least not openly, but monasteries were insulated worlds. Behind those heavy oak doors anything could happen. The method was rarely documented, perhaps deliberately so, but you can imagine the simplicity. A knife from the kitchens, a branding iron from the smithy, a cloth to muffle the screams. No marble mosaics, no ritual chants, just the cold efficiency of punishment. In some cases, prisoners of war taken by church-backed militias were subjected to the same fate, as both humiliation and deterrent. Historians still argue whether these instances were isolated cruelty or part of a broader unspoken practice. The scarcity of written records suggests secrecy was paramount. After all, what monastery would want to admit to mutilating its own? There's a quirky note in one chronicle about monks who sang too sweetly after their punishments. Their voices higher and clearer than before. It echoes the Byzantine idea of angelic tones, but here it carried an undertone of unease. Imagine attending midnight mass, the incense thick in the air, and hearing a choir of voices that sounded almost unearthly. To some it might have seemed divine, to others it was a reminder of what had been lost to the knife. One debated case involves Abelard, the medieval philosopher and lover of Heloise. After their scandalous affair, he was attacked by hired men and castrated, likely with Heloise's relatives behind it. While Abelard lived on to write theology that shaped European thought, his mutilation symbolised how castration could function as both personal revenge and a tool of moral policing. Was his case unique, or was it simply one of the rare times such an event was recorded in detail? Scholars still wonder. As you walk the abbey halls in your mind, the silence grows heavier. The flicker of candlelight seems less comforting, more menacing. You can almost hear the scrape of a knife on a whetstone in some unseen chamber, the shuffle of sandals against flagstones as someone is led away. Unlike the grand displays of Byzantium or the organised factories of China, here the act was hidden, whispered, deniable. And that secrecy may be the most chilling part. For the one who suffered, life afterwards was a half-existence. No family, no role in the broader society, only the endless repetition of prayers and duties under stone arches that echoed with every step. You remember the salt tang of Sumerian temples, the vinegar jars of China, the glowing irons of Byzantium, but here it is the sense that scars the deepest. The church promised salvation, yet in these shadows, salvation was carved with steel, and temptation was answered with mutilation. The palace in Istanbul hums with restrained opulence, tiled courtyards glowing under lantern light, fountains murmuring in the dark, silk curtains stirring in a faint breeze. Yet behind this beauty, cruelty thrived. You're walking into the world of the Ottoman harem, where the most trusted guardians were men who had been reshaped by violence. They were called eunuchs, and most came from far beyond the empire's borders. Boys taken from Africa, marched across deserts, and subjected to a procedure so extreme that only a fraction survived. The method here was among the most terrifying in history. Unlike partial castrations practiced elsewhere, Ottoman surgeons often removed both testicles and the penis, cutting everything away in one brutal stroke. The wound was then sealed with a stick inserted to keep the urethra open while the body tried to heal. Imagine the horror of lying on woven mats, fever consuming you, every nerve on fire. The survival rate was abysmally low. Some sources suggest as few as 1 in 10 boys lived through the ordeal. The rest died from blood loss, shock, or infection. And yet the survivors entered the very heart of power. They guarded the Sultan's wives and concubines, controlled access to the harem, and became indispensable to the empire's inner workings. The chief black eunuch, known as the Kızlar Ağası, wielded immense political influence. He managed not only the harem but also charitable endowments across the empire. It's a chilling paradox, mutilation as a gateway to authority. Historians still argue about who carried out the procedure itself. Some claim it was performed in remote villages along slave routes. Others suggest it was done in specialised stations once the boys reached Ottoman lands. Either way, it was not the gleaming marble of the palace where it happened, but dusty, dimly lit rooms where boys screamed and often never rose again. By the time the survivors were presented to the palatese, they were already marked by suffering that would haunt them for life. There's a curious note in travellers' accounts from the 17th century. Eunuchs were sometimes described as wearing perfumes so strong that they seemed to carry a permanent aura of spice and rosewater. Some speculate this was to mask the smell of chronic infections, since their altered bodies often struggled with complications. Picture walking into a hall where power is negotiated not just through whispers and gold, but through the overwhelming scent of musk. A human being turned into both gatekeeper and symbol of the empire's control, and you might think such men were despised, but in truth many were respected, even feared. Their proximity to the women of the harem gave them influence no vizier could match. They carried letters, brokered secrets, and sometimes even manipulated succession. One eunuch might have more sway in the palace than 100 warriors on the battlefield. Still, the price they had paid for that position never faded. Every step they took, every robe they wore was a reminder of what had been cut away. Imagine now the heavy doors of the harem closing behind you, the muffled laughter of concubines drifting through silk partitions, the eunuch standing silently with downcast eyes, yet knowing every secret in the room. He survived what most could not, and his survival bound him forever to the empire's machinery. For him, death might have been kinder than this half-life, but in the Ottoman world, half-lives could still shape empires. The air burns your nostrils with the sting of salt and sour vinegar. You are no longer in marble palaces or cloistered abbeys, but in the shadow of the Persian Empire, where punishment could be as inventive as it was merciless. Here, castration was not merely a surgical strike. It was paired with substances that turned wounds into furnaces. The Persian salt method, as later writers called it, was a practice so excruciating that survival sometimes felt more like a curse than a blessing. The act itself was swift at first, a knife or blade cutting away flesh in the usual way, but then came the treatment. Instead of bandages or balms, the wound was packed with salt or washed with vinegar. Picture it: salt grains pressed into raw tissue, each crystal a shard of fire. Or vinegar, biting deep into the wound, sizzling like acid against nerves already screaming. The theory was that this prevented infection, cleansing the flesh, but in practice, it was agony that stretched far beyond the moment of the cut. You can almost feel your body writhing, desperate to escape your own skin. Historians still argue about how widespread this method was. Some say it was reserved for enemies of the state, a punishment meant to cripple men and mark them permanently. Others suggest it was used in slave markets, ensuring captives could serve without the distraction of desire or the potential of fathering children. Whatever the context, the use of salt and vinegar made the Persian approach infamous. Even centuries later, chroniclers wrote about it with a mixture of horror and disbelief, and yet, a quirky note slips into some of these accounts. Surviving eunuchs treated with salt were sometimes admired for their resilience, as if endurance itself became proof of strength. There are scattered references to men who lived long lives after such ordeals, even serving in royal households or armies. Imagine the paradox: crippled and humiliated, yet also elevated because they had not died. Pain, in this twisted logic, became a kind of resume. Of course, not all who endured the salt lived to tell their story. Many succumbed to fever, their bodies overwhelmed. Others lived with infections that never fully healed, their wounds reopening again and again with each movement. You can almost hear the rattle of chains, the shuffle of feet in Persian courts, where mutilated men stood as silent warnings to all who looked upon them. The debate continues among scholars whether salt was applied out of genuine belief in its healing powers, or as deliberate cruelty disguised as medicine. Salt, after all, was precious in the ancient world, preservative of meat and fish, a symbol of purity in rituals. Perhaps its use on human flesh was born of that same duality, preservation wrapped in torment. Vinegar, too, had its medicinal role as a cleanser, but here, it burned like punishment disguised as treatment. Imagine lying in a dark chamber, the air thick with incense, your body quivering as hands press salt deeper into your wound. Outside, the empire continues. Soldiers march, courtiers flatter, kings feast, but for you time has slowed into one long moment of searing pain. You survive, perhaps. You even stand again, dressed in robes of servitude. But every step, every movement, reminds you of the salt, of the vinegar, of the night your body was rewritten by fire. The Persian salt method was not just mutilation. It was a philosophy of dominance, a way of branding submission into the flesh, and in its own bitter way it worked. For centuries the memory of salt in wounds lingered, whispered like a warning through the corridors of history. The air is heavy with incense, curling in slow ribbons around the dim room. You are in India now, where the story of castration takes on a different face. Less about punishment from rulers, more about transformation within ritual. The Hijra community, known for centuries as a third gender, practiced a form of self-creation that was both spiritual and terrifying. Here, castration was not forced by empires or cloaked in political intrigue, but offered up willingly as an act of rebirth. That doesn't make it any less painful. The ritual, called Nirvan, was usually performed not in sterile clinics but in modest houses or temples, under the guidance of a senior Hijra. There were no surgeons in white coats, no anesthesia. Instead, the tools could be as simple as a sharp blade, heated briefly over a flame. A small prayer was whispered. Offerings were sometimes made to the goddess Bahuchara Mata, and then the act began. In one swift cut, the genitals were removed, often without stitches or medical dressing. Ashes, turmeric, or herbal mixtures were applied to the wound, believed to both purify and heal. Imagine the sting, the raw shock, the body trembling under candlelight. Historians still argue about how old this practice truly is. Some say it stretches back to ancient times, tied to fertility cults and myths of gods who blurred gender. Others suggest it crystallized more recently, shaped by social ostracism and the need for marginalized communities to define their own identity. The precise origins remain shrouded in both oral tradition and secrecy. What is clear is that for those who underwent it, the act was as much spiritual as physical. They weren't just losing flesh, they were gaining a new role in society. And that role carried both stigma and reverence. Hijras were often marginalized, mocked, and excluded from mainstream life. Yet at the same time, they were invited to bless weddings and births, believed to hold a kind of sacred power precisely because of their liminal state. A quirky detail: in some villages, refusing a Hidra's blessing was considered bad luck, so families would eagerly hand over coins and sweets to avoid misfortune. It's a strange balance. Feared on the streets, yet welcomed in rituals where fate hung in the air. Survival, however, was never guaranteed. Many who underwent Nirvan did not live long afterward, felled by infection or blood loss. Those who did survive carried the scars, physical and emotional, throughout their lives. The pain of the cut was said to last for days, sometimes weeks, but the transformation was permanent. A new name, a new kinship, a new place in the world. To walk away from that chamber of incense and shadow was to step into a different existence, one that society would never fully understand, but could never erase. The debate among modern scholars is whether the ritual should be seen as empowerment or as tragic necessity forced by social exclusion. Was it a choice freely made, or the only path left open to those pushed outside the margins of family and community? Perhaps, like many things in history, it was both. Picture yourself in that dim room, the floor cool beneath your feet, the chant of prayers vibrating in your chest. The blade flashes, the body convulses, the herbs burn against raw flesh. Outside, life continues. Markets bustle, children play, cows wander freely in the streets. But inside you have just been remade, caught forever between man, woman, and something more. The pain may fade, but the memory of that night, the incense, the cut, the silence afterward, never will. The world feels closer now. No incense, no mosaics, no palace corridors, just the raw clang of the 20th century with its prisons, laboratories, and courtrooms. You're walking into an era that promised progress and science, yet somehow found ways to recycle the knife. Castration in modern times wasn't cloaked in myth or ritual anymore. It was dressed up as medicine, justice, or even morality. That thin veneer only makes it more chilling. In Nazi Germany, thousands of men accused of homosexuality were castrated under so-called medical supervision. Doctors in white coats justified it as treatment, claiming it would cure what they considered deviance. Imagine lying on a metal table under bright lights, shackled by straps, the hum of clinical instruments replacing the chants of ancient priests. The pain was no less real, only now it wore the mask of science. And long after the war ended, echoes of this persisted. Forced sterilizations in the United States and Scandinavia, justified by eugenics, carried out well into the mid-20th century. Historians still argue whether these procedures were primarily driven by ideology or convenience. Was it truly about controlling genetics, or simply about silencing those considered troublesome to the state? Either way, the blade had returned, sharper and more systematic than ever before, but it wasn't only states. Some criminal courts ordered chemical or surgical castration for men convicted of sexual crimes. In Czechoslovakia, for example, surgical castration was legally sanctioned as recently as the early 2000s for repeat offenders. In parts of the United States and Europe, chemical castration, using drugs to suppress testosterone, became a condition of parole. The language was softer, clinical, but the message was the same. Power, identity, and agency cut away in the name of control. A quirky case emerges from Denmark in the mid-century where some men volunteered for castration, not to enter palaces or serve kings, but to reduce their sexual drive, claiming it had brought them peace of mind. One man wrote that he could finally focus on music after the procedure. His distractions gone. It's strange, almost absurd, to think of castration as a form of self-improvement, like swapping coffee for herbal tea. Yet history insists on its oddities. Meanwhile, debates still rage over whether such modern practices were ever ethical. Were chemical treatments truly voluntary when offered to prisoners in exchange for reduced sentences? Were the so-called patients of eugenics programs ever given real choice? Or were they coerced by the weight of stigma and law? Scholars dissect these questions, but the stories of those who lay on operating tables remain quieter, folded into archives. Imagine now the sterile smell of disinfectant, the gleam of surgical steel. You lie staring at fluorescent lights, knowing the procedure will not kill you, but that some part of you will never return. Unlike the ancient torchlit chambers or the steppe campfires, here the pain is delivered with calm efficiency, with paperwork filed afterward. And perhaps that bureaucratic neatness is the most terrifying part. It turns suffering into policy, mutilation into routine. The 20th century showed that castration was not a relic of the past, but a shadow that adapted. Whether through scalpels, syringes, or pills, societies continued to decide whose bodies were acceptable, whose desires could remain. You can almost hear the shuffle of papers in courtrooms, the cold signatures of judges, the quiet hum of hospital corridors. The blade may be hidden, but it never really left. The room grows quieter now, though the echoes of all you've seen linger, temple torches flickering, vinegar jars stinking, horsehair tourniquets biting, abbey whispers thickening, palace eunuchs perfumed in rosewater, Persian salt burning, Hijra incense swirling, Nazi clinics humming. Across thousands of years, castration has carried a singular message: control. It was never just about flesh. It was about reshaping destiny, silencing rivals, binding servants, or forcing transformation. And even when the knife was put away, the shadow remained. In every empire that practiced it, eunuchs stood as both warnings and paradoxes. Stripped of the very thing that defined male inheritance, they often rose to power precisely because of that absence. In China, they dictated emperors' fates. In Byzantium, they ruled armies. In the Ottoman harem, they held sway over secrets more valuable than armies of men. You'd think mutilation would end a life. Instead, it sometimes carved paths into influence. Yet that power always came with stigma, scars hidden beneath silks or robes, reminders of what had been taken. Historians still argue how to interpret these figures. Were eunuchs tragic victims of cruelty or survivors who mastered the roles forced upon them? Were they agents of history shaping dynasties or tools wielded by those in power? The truth resists simple answers. Perhaps both are true at once, just as every scar is both wound and mark of survival. And then there's the way memory lingers. Even today, the word castration carries a primal chill. It appears in metaphors. Political rivals castrated by defeats. Machines castrated of their power. The fear is instinctive, almost universal. That tells you something. Deep down, humanity has never forgotten the torchlit rooms, the jars of vinegar, the hot irons. The knife still hangs in imagination, even if most no longer see it in practice. A quirky little note here. Some modern performances of early music speculate that castrati singers, those boys castrated to preserve their high voices in 17th and 18th century Europe, might echo the angelic tones once heard in Byzantine cathedrals. Imagine it, packed opera houses swooning over voices made possible only by mutilation. Audiences applauding what history now shudders to remember. Beauty extracted through violence, another reminder that even culture has shadows. So where does that leave you standing at the end of this long, painful corridor of history? Perhaps uneasy, perhaps reflective. You've walked through temples, palaces, monasteries, camps and clinics, and in each you've seen how fragile the body is when power decides it should bend. Castration wasn't only about punishment or purity, it was about dominance, empires carving obedience into flesh, communities reshaping identity, governments disguising cruelty as progress, and though the knife may be hidden now, the shadow it casts still lingers. In every whisper about loyalty, every debate about control, every story of bodies altered by force, that history flickers. You step out of the dark chamber of memory into the quieter night, carrying the weight of all those echoes, and as the world settles around you, you realize the terror of castration was never just the pain of the blade. It was the reminder that no matter the century, power has always claimed the right to decide what a body can be. And now, as the echoes fade, let yourself drift away from the sharpness of knives and the weight of history. The torches dim, the chants hush, the clatter of swords and sandals softens into silence. All those chambers, stone, silk or sterile, grow hazy in the distance, dissolving like smoke rising into the night. You don't have to hold them anymore. They were never yours to carry. Instead, let your breathing slow, each inhale longer, each exhale softer. Imagine the scarred corridors turning into quiet fields, the heavy walls into open sky. The fear that once echoed there ebbs away, leaving only stillness. The salt, the iron, the vinegar, the shadows, they all dissolve into a gentle nothing carried off on the breeze. You are safe now, far from kings and priests, far from punishments and empires. What remains is only calm, the steady rhythm of your chest, the faint hum of the world around you. Let your eyes grow heavier with each passing moment. Let the stories soften into dreams. Sleep now, not in fear but in peace.